Hey, everyone, and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. Up on this video, we are going to be talking about the campus protests, demonstrations, riots, and the response that continuing campuses have had to them, police have had to them, and what it means and what's actually allowed under the First Amendment. And truly, as even someone in the law, I've been grappling with this: is what is allowed, how far does this go? We have the right under the First Amendment of assembly, we have the right to free speech, but how far can it go? Are these campuses, can they disband assembly? Can they take away these encampments? These are all questions we're going to be grappling with today. I'm an attorney. I've been working for over 18 years. I'm the CEO of the Law Unscripted, which is hosting the Weekly Wine, as well as an attorney with Tarani Law LLC, because you never need a lawyer till you do. I am mostly a trial attorney, so I don't have to deal too much with the First Amendment normally. And I am joined today by Chelsea Rogers, who is the partner of Tarani Law and also another trial attorney. Good to see you and welcome.
Glad to be here. I think we have a lot to talk about today.
Absolutely. And I think you're a little bit more up with, how the wonderful jargon, up with the First Amendment and campus issues, because you've recently graduated from law school. You're much more close to this than either Dr. Weil or I in terms of being a student and having recently studied the First Amendment. So I'm really excited to get your take on it today. And Dr. Weil also will have a very significant take because he is a current professor in a college. He is the dean of the Honors College of Middle Tennessee State University. He works with students every day, is in the educational scene. He's also a constitutional scholar, Constitution itself, the amending process, and constitutional law. So I'm privileged, we're privileged to have you as well for your take today. Welcome, Dr. Weil.
May I add here?
Please.
One of the projects that I'm most interested in is several years back, I co-edited a 2-volume encyclopedia of the First Amendment. And that amendment has since been purchased and is now online for free at Middle Tennessee State University. So you just go into First Amendment Encyclopedia, and it says we have over 1,700 entries, but I think I've written probably 50 to 100 this year, and I don't know if they're counted yet. But almost any topic you want, you'll get at least an introduction, and each one has cross-references to others. They list cases, and there's a bibliography with each one. So some of the, you could type in campus protest or symbolic speech or any number of topics. And if you don't get the right one the first, probably just look at the cross-reference and you'll see something else that's more relevant.
Excellent. And that is a free resource. So I think that's very important. It's available to the public.
We get, I believe, about 3 million hits a year on it. So a lot of people are, and it's specifically designed, I think, especially for students. So, particularly high school or college students that are interested in, sort of a starting point. It's a good place to go. And almost occasionally, last week, I was fortunate enough to find a First Amendment case from the 20th century that we had missed. But we have not only Supreme Court cases. I took a sort of a special task of looking for a lot of 19th century cases where, you had anti-blasphemy laws and Sunday closing laws and a lot of things that for the most part, you would not have today, but that sort of provide some background for current First Amendment understandings.
Excellent. And the other resource we have, though this one is not free, is on the lawunscripted.com. The three of us have resources. They're mostly put as an aid for law students who are studying the 8 core subjects, as well as students studying for the bar. But there's a great resource that is there for anyone, including the general public, for constitutional law. is we have a section just for constitutional law. And Dr. Vile's in the one called video reviews, the constitutional law video review section. And we have 3 videos for that where Dr. Vile, you take us through each and every piece of the Constitution. And we have an entire section just on the First Amendment. And Dr. Vile breaks down many of those significant cases, the implications, the different freedoms we have through the First Amendment. So that is available to the public as well as law students, especially those studying for the bar this summer, right? So those studying for the bar, you have access to the constitutional part, but also 7 other core subjects such as contracts, torts, criminal law, civil procedure, that sort of thing. So if you're looking for a supplement to the bar classes that you're taking, please log on to thelawanscripted.com to find those resources. And everyone, please like and subscribe to this channel so that you can find out what's happening with the law. What's happening on a weekly basis. We are updating every week, so make sure that you hit that like and subscribe so that you can catch us every week. But let's get on to our topic. We do want to talk about these campus protests. Chelsea, I know you have been inundated with a lot of the media. Tell us your overall understanding of what is actually happening and why.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the biggest questions to me, is because what we're talking about is protests happening on over 50 different campuses across the United States. So we have varying levels of things happening at each place. And so it gets really hard to sort of dissect every little thing when we're lumping them all together, and they're very different sort of things. I mean, we have things going on in California, very, very large, in New York at Columbia, these huge sort of encampments that are often garnering at this point some police response, and then counter protesters, who are not even part of the original encampments, then protesting the police involvement on the campuses. But then you have very small universities with smaller protests that, are sort of been left alone. So we're talking about a wide sort of swath of activities. But generally, very, very broadly and generally speaking, what we have now is a lot of students on college campuses right now protesting the involvement and support of Israel sort of in this conflict that is happening in Gaza, to varying levels with varying different demands, is where I think we also get into it. Different asks that are happening on some campuses. And then we sort of get this broader question of like, what's the purpose of protest? Is it inconveniencing? Is the graduations that have been canceled part of the purpose of protest? What is the correct response to protest on public and private universities, which are different? What are the asks that are reasonably accomplished by these universities in responding to these protests? So there's a lot, I feel like, that's happening that is getting caught up in sort of this moment.
And
Yeah.
may I raise a central distinction that Chelsea
Please.
is pointing us to? There is a difference legally in what public and private universities can do. And the reason is the First Amendment says Congress shall not, starts with religion, but can abridge speech or press. And because of Supreme Court interpretations, that has subsequently been applied to state action as well through the 14th Amendment. So states and the federal government cannot abridge freedom of speech or the press. Now, if you're a private university, if you're not acting as a state actor, you probably have, you can impose greater restrictions than if you were the government. So that's part of what's going on here. And the problem, of course, with the current demonstrations, and there are a couple of problems with them. One is one has to ask, why are we demonstrating against one thing and not another? So, one of the most horrendous events in the last however many years was the initial attack by Hamas on Israel.
Right.
I mean, people were raped, children were killed, there are American hostages right now in Gaza. And it was not something that we initiated. There was actually a ceasefire that was breached when this occurred. Now, some people are saying, well, why wasn't there now the outrage right now is the fact that in the process of defeating Hamas, bombs don't always detect who's a civilian and who's not. And Hamas is well known for infiltrating in civilian populations in order to keep themselves, and even underground. So the reaction right now is primarily in protest of what is believed to be excessive force or indiscriminate force on the part of Israel. And that, that certainly, I mean, that's a valid concern for sure.
Right. And I think the biggest issue that the entire country is grappling with, not just the students on these campuses, is how far can Israel go to destroy Hamas? Are they it appears to many people that they're just destroying the entirety of Gaza.
Right.
And of course, much of Gaza has underground tunnel. I mean,
Right.
We do know that our own response after 9/11 did not always clearly distinguish, there were a lot of people in Afghanistan who had nothing to do with it.
Right.
And
Right.
Iraq who had even probably less to do with 9/11. And yet, we inflicted many casualties, including civilians, in order to eliminate the danger. So, war
Right.
is not pretty. We that's part of it. The other complicating factor on campus is, in addition to one's normal, one should on campus be able to expect to go to class.
Mm.
Typically, if you've been to the University of Virginia, one of my alma maters, the lawn is one of the most beautiful places on campus, designed by Thomas Jefferson. When you sign up to go there, you're probably not intending to see a tent city in the middle of it. For aesthetic reasons, as for no other. So part of the problem is in many schools, we have a fair number of Jewish students, you have a fair number of Palestinian students. Once a demonstration occurs, you can't always control who takes the mic and what they say. And if you're a Jewish student, you're walking by and they're saying from the river to the sea, which in Hamas jargon means we're going to wipe out the state of Israel. They have no
Not
right
just
to
a catchy
exist.
chant.
Right. You're
Right.
going to feel intimidated. And students have some rights not to be intimidated. So,
Right.
you have to have a balance. And typically, what public universities have to watch is they need to watch and make sure that what they're doing is what we would refer to as content neutral. You can't allow Jewish students or supporters of Israel, let's put it that way. You can't allow supporters of Israel to set up encampments in the middle of the campus or break into a building and occupy it if you're unwilling to allow Arab students to do the same thing. If you are even-handedly saying you can protest, you can do it here, you can do it at this time, what the Constitution is interpreted to accept are reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on speech. You can't, and you wouldn't want to shut up students or professors. They have a right to express their opinion. And there's no, unfortunately, both sides, I mean, I think it'd be hard to make anything much positive on Hamas's side, but you can certainly argue on behalf of the people of Gaza.
Yes.
And you can
Yeah. And I think
certainly,
that's what
yeah,
it is I think it's hard because I think especially I always try to keep this in context too. Not that I'm so much older, but like we're talking about college students who are a lot of students under the age of 22. And this is with, I think that it's hard for me looking. I had this conversation with my mom off air actually, because I'm like, I have a really hard time with people trying to go and get these like clickbait viral moments. These students don't know what they're talking about. I'm like, they are really young. And like, this is their first time sort of engaging in a conversation about what they, a human rights violation, to be perfectly clear, these people being killed and they're watching it live on TikTok. Right.
Right.
And so I have a really hard time with people trying to go and get these like clickbait moments or like from these students who are young and trying to engage with it. I think maybe I have higher expectations of how the universities should be handling these things than perhaps out of the students who are participating in the demonstrations themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's true. Is students, everybody is getting the press is inundating us with these ideas, and other countries are claiming human rights violations, that Israel is doing human rights violations. We're seeing in the press Palestinians being starved to death because they don't have access to the
Right.
food. We've seen, what's the aid group where many of their people were killed and they're
The food
neutral?
relief group, right?
Right. The food relief groups, they're being targeted. And the question is, was Israel doing it on purpose to prevent the aid and the food to getting to Palestinians? Are they trying to eliminate the entire population? So for as bad as the chant is of to the river, to the sea, is Israel doing the same thing just without their chant? Is they're trying to eliminate the entire population of Palestine? So I think the students and many of us who aren't students and aren't protesting on campus, there's this big question of, is Israel doing the right thing in this war because they were provoked?
You have the same conversation going on in Israel.
Yes.
You've had many. I mean, the one really positive thing to say about Israel is they are basically or have been a liberal democracy. I mean,
right.
People have been permitted to question what the prime minister has done,
right?
Whether the policy is correct or not.
And that's contrary to what we seem to be seeing with Russia and the Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Is what we appear to be seeing in that war. So let's not forget that there's another very public war throughout the planet. I hate to say it that way, but I don't know how else to say it. Of Russia appears to be, putting people aside or hiding them or killing them for any protests that they're making against their own government about the war with Ukraine. So we have that of their country, their government is saying, you can't protest this.
Right.
And if you do, you're anti-government, we're going to do something to you. So it's a very big risk.
The primary line that no university should give in on is the line between speech and violent action.
Yeah.
And, we need to be consistent. If, like me, you believe the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, and particularly those who broke through windows and trespasses, passed and made threats, if you believe they should be prosecuted, in their mind, they had a high call, they believed the election had been stolen. They were fighting for what they believed, presumably.
Absolutely.
College students believe whatever they believe, but that doesn't give them the right to break into buildings, as particularly in Colombia. And I think, any administration, they have to keep at the very least, they need to keep control of their facilities. If they have a policy that says we don't permit any camping on campus, I think they have the right, particularly as a private university, but even as a public university, to say, these are spaces that are reserved for student recreation or aesthetics or whatever, as long as they, enforce that even-handedly. And what's fascinating, of course, is, I was in college relatively young in 1970. Colleges have typically been sort of, well, if you go back to the early civil rights movements, there were riots sometimes when college campuses were integrated. George Wallace, you remember, famously stood in front of a door to try to prevent an African American from being admitted.
Right.
But 1960s, all kinds of civil rights demonstrations, some of which originated, on campuses. In the late 60s, it was primarily protests against the Vietnam War.
Right.
And I was just looking at the date here. So it would have been, again, it's very, very close. May 4th of 1970, there was a demonstration at Kent State University, and they were confronted by members of the National or State Guard, I guess it was. And they, if I remember correctly, shot and killed 5 unarmed students.
These are very dramatic pictures that
it was, on the front page of Time magazine, which was one of the most, read news magazines at the time. So, and then we've had subsequent demonstrations for women's rights, for LGBTQ rights. Protest is totally acceptable. The most effective protests, in my judgment, have been nonviolent. Sometimes they have involved civil disobedience. We're going to sit here and protest, but some of them were more directly targeted. I mean, what's happening here is students seem to be saying you should divest of anybody dealing with the arms industry, or anybody dealing with Israel.
Right.
Well, is that how directly related is that? I don't know. I mean, I think that's part of the issue. And or do you have a similar policy with anybody who deals with Russia? Anybody who deals with Hamas, anybody who deals with Iran. And I don't think, I think protesters can demand what they want, but I don't think you're well, I don't think at all. I don't think you're obligated to heed the loudest voices. And I heard a college president, Ben Sass, actually saying this morning, that just because just somebody speaks the loudest or gets the most attention doesn't mean that their cause is more just than another. Should a university consider where they invest their money? Well, sure. You make a good case that they shouldn't be invested in cigarettes, maybe even in alcohol. List what it is that you object to. But just because students object to something doesn't mean that a college necessarily has to follow their objection. Do we know that they represent the majority?
Right.
Do we
And
know?
even if they did, are the students the one who get to dictate where the university takes
that's right.
funds from?
There were also, I guess, a little bit later than when I was in school, but there were anti-apartheid protests.
For South America.
Right.
For
South
I'm
Africa.
sorry, South Africa. Thank you.
But, again, some of these matters are more complicated than they appear. You think you're hurting the government of the country. Maybe you're just driving down the price so they can sell it. There are all kinds of nooks and crannies here that need to be explored. Students have the same right as anybody else to be listened to, but they have no more right than I do or anybody else to dictate what policy should be. And, just because you've had a demonstration doesn't mean that the government has to give in to what you say on either side. Yeah.
Chelsea, I see you.
I think
Yes.
I provoked
No,
her.
No, because I think this is really interesting. And truly, this is something that I have just been hyper focusing all week, because I have a lot of conflicting, and I think I have more questions about what all of this, sort of the bigger questions here. But one of the things I think is interesting is that, like it or not, like how they did or not, they got the president's attention, right? And so I think that's the thing, that the president of the country, we're not even just talking about, attention in their communities, on their campuses, sort of this coordinated effort. And I do think, not all of the schools, to be clear, but I do think there was a coordinated effort across campuses by a lot of these schools to coordinate this. And they got the president's attention, which, take that for what it is. If you're saying you want someone to acknowledge what's going on, it wasn't a great response. If what they wanted was, hey, this is going to direct policy, that certainly was not the response they got by President Biden.
From a political science standpoint, and take it a little bit outside the law, I'm worried about the effectiveness in terms of where do you want to go. What it looks like is happening is what happens what was the result, particularly not of the campus demonstrations, some of which we would hope maybe or think might come to an end, because I just sat through 3 graduations over 2 days.
And your campus allowed them, versus these other campuses with demonstrations are shutting their graduations down.
Right. But if you remember the reaction to a lot of the student protests, and then particularly, we have conventions coming up, and the primary images from the 1968 Democratic Convention were images of police bashing in the heads of anti-Vietnam War protesters And the election was not won by the more liberal of the two candidates. Hubert Humphrey, who actually had distanced himself toward the end, at least, from the policies of Lyndon Johnson. The election didn't go to him, it went to Richard Nixon, who most students utterly despised and hated. Or not most of the students who would have been demonstrating, let's put it that way. And so, this is as likely to provoke countermeasures and, people already, for better or worse, I don't know why, but well, part of what's happening here, if you look at the colleges where this is happening, they tend to be very elite. Ivy League, right?
Columbia, where it started.
NYU, Emory, UCLA, USC, schools that are, really prestigious. They have outrageous tuition. And a lot of people look at that and they're going to say, these are a bunch of brats. These are, their parents are paying their way. And what are they doing? Instead of studying for final exams, they're out there, throwing bottles or issuing taunts. So in terms of effectiveness, they may not be, it might make you feel good without doing good. And of course, that's always a balancing act that you have with, you can maybe say that about some of the civil rights protests.
Right.
But at least there you can say, the leaders were cautioning nonviolence, civil disobedience. If you're arrested, you don't fight back, you go to jail, you pay the penalty, you do whatever, and then proceed. And I'm not, this movement doesn't seem quite as organized for that. And my fear is that it may have consequences very similar to some of the demonstrations, and maybe the Vietnam demonstrations ultimately succeeded, but Nixon, the war didn't end until 6 years or so after these, or better, after these demonstrations started. So
right. And I think some of the influences that are occurring with the actual professors, with the administrators, is the idea of, okay, it's not about the protests, it's about the fear it's invoking on campus for our Jewish students.
Right.
Of, it seems like they're issuing threats of violence against our Jewish students. We have to protect them.
Right.
So Dr. Weil, let me ask you, what is available? Is it okay for these campuses to be saying, we're worried about violence, especially against our Jewish students, and even without that, we're worried about violence on campus? Do they have the right to call in law enforcement? Because I think a lot of people are having visceral reactions of, no, they can't have people come in and forcibly remove the students. But what rights do they have?
I'm going to dodge it for just a minute to tell you that years ago, I went to a conference in Greece. And I was listening to students there who claimed that they rarely met with their professors, that some schools had declared that they were police-free zones and students could basically do what they wanted. I would not want to be on I would not want to be on a campus where police come in and bash my head in, but I also would not want to be on a campus where if other people started bashing my head in, we could have, and one of the most obvious is, I think it was USC. There, frankly, it appears now, and again, it's interesting, with civil rights, they always talked about outside agitators.
Yes.
People are still saying the same thing. It does appear that some of the people at Columbia and elsewhere were not students.
Right.
And some of the taunting that was done, apparently of Jewish students, was by non-students. So that's part of the problem. But at USC, it appears as though the people who initiated violence were actually attacking those supporting the Palestinian cause.
They were
attacking
the protest.
Their police apparently were not called or did not intervene for a good hour. People were injured during that time. So in my judgment, I don't think that I don't think that police need necessarily an invitation if they see violence occurring. And I think an administrator, if they see that students are jeopardized, they do have an obligation, in my judgment, to use force. Hopefully, you try to use minimal force. You try to give due warning. But you really shouldn't need to warn somebody that breaking in to a building and occupying it, particularly if students are supposed to be taking exams or professors are supposed to be doing research, you really shouldn't need to be able to tell them that that's wrong and illegal and you're going to pay a price for it. And, before people get their little medals for participation, some of these can have serious consequences. If you've actually committed a felony, people aren't going to say, well, did you do it on behalf of a good cause? Right. They're going to say good cause or bad, you don't have the right. I mean, it's like the U.S. Capitol. Whoever you think won the election, you don't have the right to tear down doors and break through windows and assault police officers or fellow students or whoever else.
Chelsea, what's your reaction as far as especially the police and law enforcement presence on the campuses?
Yeah,
because again, you're so much closer to the recent student population.
Yes, I have, and I'm going to say, I feel like I have very and I've said this just with this, I feel like this is really hard. I have a lot of visceral reactions. I have what I, think about the law. So a couple things. I feel for a lot of the students who are having their graduation canceled. I viscerally feel that. In the same way, I completely understand the students who are saying, okay, wham, your, elite school and your graduation got canceled and kids are dying. I get it, right? I think you can hold both to be true and be sad all around for everything. I feel that I feel on some of these campuses, we're talking about, we've had over 2,000 students arrested across the United States, right? That's the numbers we're looking at. That's concerning to me. I have a lot of feelings about police presence on campuses anyways. But you do have this problem, right? Especially when you have a movement this big, this many people. And I know this is not the most cohesive sentence, it just shows how my sort of mixed feelings are on this. You're gonna have people who are there to agitate and cause havoc. And then you have people there who are true believers who really feel like they have a right to be there. And it can be hard. I have sympathy for some of the officers who are being called in to be here. How do you sort those people out? I don't know if there's a good way to do it, but I do find it concerning. And then what we've had on some of these campuses where it hasn't quite gotten to the point of occupying buildings or actual violence, we just have these kids who are essentially camping out and they're calling police in to haul them away. Then you have other students who were not protesting initially and faculty joining to come say, you can't do that. I'm going to form a line around them, free speech. I think truthfully, I've never been much of a protest person myself. I have a lot of feelings, but I've tried to do sort of more hands-on work than necessarily protest and bring awareness. But I think at that point I would step in. If I was on a college campus and people were peacefully protesting and I was watching cops haul them off, I think that's a point for me where I would be out there and being absolutely not. I don't know how you balance that all. There's a lot of things playing. I don't think there's an easy answer for this, which is what everyone wants to hear, right? That there's an easy, simple way to fix this. I don't think it's that easy.
And again, part of it comes to, is there a perception of content neutrality?
Right.
Are you applying the same, if you had a pro-Hamas group, if there is such a thing, or a pro-Palestinian group, pro-Jewish group, would you treat them in the same manner?
Right.
And that's difficult.
Yeah, it's hard to interpret because you don't have the other types of protesters, so you can't demonstrate that you would do the same thing.
Yes,
because there's
nobody there being yay terrorism, right? We don't have groups of people doing that the way we have, people saying let's stop committing, war crimes, right? I think it's really hard to put those
human genocide.
But there's a fascinating case which we haven't discussed yet before the Supreme Court right now as to whether you can keep people from setting up tent cities who are just poor.
The homeless.
The homeless. And, there's a famous saying that, a a law that applies to keep people from sleeping under bridges applies equally to poor people or rich people. But, you know, what rich
people aren't
person needs
there.
to sleep under a bridge? So sometimes the law
Exactly.
can appear to be more content neutral, perhaps, than it actually is in terms of application. But
Mhm.
I mean, I think even if for no other reason, well, speech is more important than aesthetics, but
Right.
I certainly think students have the right not to have their access to classes
Yeah.
blocked or student services blocked. Somebody wants to have a demonstration, that's fine. But if they want to keep me from going to class or from, you know,
Yes.
again, utilizing services, I think that does go beyond that goes beyond what you're saying into action. It's
Hmm.
obstruction or it's violence or, even taunting a student,
Yeah.
using racial epithets. I think most colleges, it would apply equally. If you referred to Jews or to Arabs as scum, either one would be something that would be inappropriate on a college campus. That does not promote deliberation.
Yeah. I think and I'll give a small example. I went to a small undergrad in Georgia. I think about this probably once a week because it happened constantly on our campus. We had a big square with a clock tower in the middle of campus. And at least once a month, usually more than that, we would have people who are not students, to be clear, protesters come onto the campus, and they would have signs like as large as like semis, these huge signs of they were anti-abortion protesters. They were AI generated type of images. They weren't, I don't know what they were supposed to be, but they were kind of graphic, right?
Yeah.
I would just be trying to go to class. I'm on scholarship. I'm just trying to go to class. And I don't particularly want to see like graphic medical images personally.
Right.
There was nothing they could do about it, but it's
Right.
hard for me to say that. It's frustrating for me because they didn't block walkways. They were just there. You just
Right.
couldn't walk to
Right.
class without seeing it. That we allow that, but we don't allow people camping out over genocide, right? The fact that we are holding these both to be true and I understand, like, I get the legal part of it, but I feel the like emotional reaction, the frustration, like how visceral it is, because that just seems important to me that we can say like, oh yeah, that's totally fine, but sorry, your tent was on the sidewalk. Let's arrest you. It is very viscerally frustrating. And I get the legality, but I'm so frustrated. I remember being a
But I
student
don't
being
think
so frustrated.
you wouldn't be able to arrest somebody simply for holding up a picture of
Right.
Gazans who had been victims of air raids, right? I mean, I
Well,
wouldn't
until they
see
said,
that.
you have by this to get off of the quad or
Right.
get, move the encampments, and they don't, right? And then they're
Right.
getting arrested.
Right.
But I think that goes back to the issue of what is the freedom of speech and how is it limited? And Dr. Val, I think it's good to go back to, how much case law has been interpreted by courts across the country and then ultimately the Supreme Court to say there's time, place, and manner restrictions
Right.
so that we can protect the other people
Right.
around it. So if it's limited to this particular place, but it's not so you can set up tents. It's not so that you can block it. It's not so that we ultimately have to shut down graduation and affect all of our other student population.
Right.
They have rights too.
Right.
So how do we protect both rights, both the right to speech and the right of the other students to go to school, to have their normal activities, to have graduation?
Well, one of the most fascinating things is Hugo Black was a famous Supreme Court justice who was known for being a First Amendment absolutist.
Mm.
Perhaps because he had been a Baptist Sunday school teacher. When he read the Constitution, which sort of was scripture for him, when it says, Congress shall make no law, they shall make no law. But interestingly, he dissented in a couple cases, one of which is Tinker versus Des Moines, when students wore black armbands to, I think it was junior and high school, in protest of the Vietnam War. He said it talks about speech, but it doesn't talk about action. That's action. He was overruled. And he was overruled, by the way, in another case, which I think is far trickier, which was a civil rights demonstration in a public library. And he essentially said, people don't come to the library. They come there to read. You got to respect that. You shouldn't expect some poor librarian to have to sit there, maybe fearful of what the demonstrators are going to do in the library. But so the short of it is the court has recognized the importance of symbolic speech.
Right.
It doesn't have to be oral. Well, and as freedom of the press would suggest, right? I mean, that's a form of written speech, oral and written speech. Well, now the court has drawn the line. One famous case, and some people think they got it wrong. The court decided that you could be arrested for burning a draft card. We don't.
Right.
I don't know.
Not the
We issue
flag,
draft
but
cards
the draft card.
But there was sort of a double reasoning there. Part of it was that the card was actually owned by the government, but more importantly, it was the card is necessary for national defense. If we had to call okay, I got a phone call here, and I'm sorry about that. Let's see if I can ignore it. It's the wife, so I think I can ignore it.
Sorry, Mom.
I can call her back.
Poor
I'm
Mrs.
sorry
Weil.
about that. Hopefully she will realize what's going on here. My apologies for that. But that's a case where the court, I don't have the 3 or 4 part test in front of me, but the court sort of established a test to try to ascertain the degree to which speech and action were interrelated. And again, the key terms are the ones that we've already used. Regulations need to be content neutral. They can't, you can't allow Democrats and not Republicans, or Republicans and not Democrats, or Israelis versus Gazans. You have to apply it equally. And then the other is reasonable, and that by the very nature accepts some judgment, but time, manner, and place restrictions.
Right. I mean, you even have to in DC, in most cities, we're in the DC DMV area, where you have to apply for permits.
Right.
To be in specific places at specific times to do a march or a speech or a demonstration.
Right. Because typically you're blocking a road or, might be creating the danger. Now, where that doesn't work, and I hope we get to do still I want to do a video on Jehovah's Witnesses, because I've just written a chapter on that. But, they were able to establish, for the most part, that you should not have to get a license or a permit in order to go door to door witnessing in their case, but in other cases, politicking or, whatever you would be able to do. That, we don't have licensing, we don't have prior restraint under the First Amendment. But if you have well thought out, content neutral laws regulating time, place, think about it. If you live next to a public park, it's reasonable to say that you can't have a rock concert that goes into 3 a.m.
Right.
Not because you got anything against music, but because nearby residents are not going to be able to get any sleep. I mean, that would be
quiet enjoyment.
That would be right. And even you can, I believe, in most cases, you can regulate decibel levels for the same reason, rights to personal privacy and the like. So in any campus, now private campus, I don't know if they could just forbid. I would hope that, I can't imagine most, particularly Ivy League schools, telling students they can't demonstrate at all. But
they have more rights, so to speak, to prevent.
They have greater leeway in that it's not governmental action. But one of the, I'm a little conflicted on this, because I'm at a state university where most of our kids, that's what I call them, but many of our students have full-time jobs. Many of them are raising families. It's very unlikely we would have demonstrations on our campus. At least, I mean, we might have a demonstration. It's not likely people would be camping over these things and the like. But I think to many people, they just see college kids and they say a bunch of spoiled brats. And, unfortunately, many of us are highly reliant upon state and to some degree federal funding.
Right.
And, I've seen a couple governors sort of chest beating, that's not going to happen in our state. We'll show them. And Ronald Reagan actually, he came to office in California after the Berkeley free speech movement, and at that time, the students who were protesting, they were grungy. They were hippies, some of them. They were smoking pot. They were engaging in sexual activities that people didn't approve of, et cetera, et cetera. And, he came into office and Hayakawa, who was one of the chancellors or presidents there, I'm going to come down strong on these students and just show them who's boss. So this is why I think these forms of protest are not, yes, they get attention.
Yes.
But the reaction that they get might actually be against the people who would be more likely to promote policies that you support. It's the people out of government who are going to say, this would never happen if I were president.
Right.
This is Biden's fault, or Nixon, whoever.
Exactly.
And I think it's
Lyndon
hard
Johnson's
too, because I agree, because that's the thing. I have a lot of strong opinions, strong feelings, but I worked full time all through college. There was not a chance that you would, even if I completely agreed with it, there was not a chance you would have caught me doing that. Just didn't have the time. That was true for a lot of people at my school, that we did have some small, but like the reality is that was just not feasible for most people. And in the same breath, I'm like, but these kids can and do, so shouldn't they be the ones to do it, right? Like, shouldn't they have the privilege and the availability to do it? If not them, then who, right? Because I might hold the same feelings and be unable to stand out there because I have to go to work and pay my rent, right? So it's hard. How do you balance that when you're like, yes, they have the privilege and then they're using it, right? And I think it's a hard line to walk.
It is, and I'm the type of person, and you two can both attest, is all of my life I've been called goody two shoes. Is I will follow the rules. That is what I do. That's my whole life. I'll follow the rules.
It's good for a lawyer.
It is,
and a daughter.
Yes. Thank you.
Follow the rules.
Chelsea knows, even just, a month or two ago, she and I and our office manager, Rebecca, were going through a writing I was doing. And I was like, oh, well, how does this sound? And one of you made an offhand comment of, you sound more ethical than most people. And it's not to puff up myself, but it's to say that Chelsea has her reasons for not having, protested. For me, I don't protest. I'll write a nice article or something, but I am so afraid of getting arrested, of having a misdemeanor or a felony or an arrest on my record. I'm terrified of breaking the law. So I would not have joined an encampment, because what if I'm arrested? I don't want that on my record, but that's my influence of, I'm more likely to write a paper and put it in the newspaper or the campus newspaper, or apply for a time and a place to make a speech, versus doing these protests where I'm setting up in an encampment and then breaking into a building because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is B&E. I'm so much of a criminal law person, and this person of strong feelings about doing the law, where I would have tried to find a way within the rules, within the law, to make my point known.
And that was that was the whole theory behind Martin Luther King's civil disobedience. So he went a little farther maybe than you would. It's like, we believe this law is unjust. We're willing to protest against it, even if it means we go to jail and have a record, but we're going to do so peacefully.
Right.
And I think my biggest concern with being in demonstrations is what it looks like is often the most radical person either takes control or ends up being the one who's interviewed and quoted on the news. And you're thinking, that's not what I was for. That person doesn't really, they were in our camp, but that's not why we're here. And I think that's
not representative.
And I think that's something the public does need to remember when, you see 100 people arrested. Maybe some of them didn't deserve, maybe some of them weren't breaking the law. Just because somebody shouted out, at a Jewish passerby doesn't mean that they supported that. And I would
think
hope
that's true. Let's put it at a more national attention piece is, January 6th.
Yeah.
is how many people were there thinking it really was an unjust election, and those who weren't breaking into the Capitol, those who weren't, actually violating the law, that got lumped in to all of the stronger causes, to all of the actual breaking and entering,
Yeah,
the
and
breaking in. But those who
hopefully that
didn't
is being sorted out. I mean,
assault the
you know,
police.
there were people who were throwing things at police officers,
Right.
and hitting them with batons and spraying them with bear spray. And whether that happens on the U.S. Capitol or on a college campus, that's not acceptable.
But
And,
as you were
I mean,
saying, people get lumped in just
right.
because they were there. If they were there for a great cause, they
Right.
thought the election was stolen. They think that Israel's going too far, but then they're associated
Right.
with those who took it way too far.
As far
they
as I'm
didn't agree
concerned,
with.
now people differ, and I do actually have respect for people in the South. I've been born there. But if I get in a demonstration and I start seeing Confederate flags and I hear people say, let's hang the vice president, I'm going to get out of there.
Right.
Yeah.
Versus
Yes.
continue through. Right.
As someone who's currently living in the South,
Yeah.
yep, got a
Yeah.
blast. I'm out. Like deuces.
Well, and again,
Yes.
Confederate, I mean, I've seen Confederate graves yards, and I think a Confederate flag is probably appropriate there. It's,
Right.
That sort of thing.
Context.
Yes, exactly. It's how and when it's shown.
Yes, time, place, and manner.
Yeah.
Now, again, and you do have the right, as far as I know, to wave a Confederate flag, even in a
The
demonstration.
right to be in the Ku Klux Klan.
Well, yes. Watch the action.
Right. No, but
Right.
that's
right.
the
Mere
ultimate
membership. Right.
is-
You have a right to be a member of a communist party.
Right.
That doesn't mean we're encouraging people to do it.
No, but it's
right.
that right of assembly in the First Amendment
Association
of
yes.
the right of association, the right of the free speech is, even if most of us or some of us find things distasteful, it's ultimately protected.
May I tell you about a book that I read this week?
Yes, please.
Okay, I don't think this was on our agenda, but
well, we can use it and wrap it up.
Okay, it's called "The Supreme Court and the Philosopher: How John Stuart Mill Shaped Free Speech Protections."
Mm-hmm.
John Stuart Mill, for those who don't know, was a British sort of mid-19th century philosopher, a utilitarian, and he wrote a book called On Liberty, which has perhaps the most persuasive arguments for freedom of speech. And he goes so far as to say he even supports false speech because he believes that we don't understand what we ourselves believe until somebody counters it. And even if somebody is 90% wrong, that 10% may be 10% that's very important for us to learn about. But here's what's so fascinating about the book. It's by two authors, by the way. Let me give you their names. Eric Casper, a political science professor at Wisconsin Eau Claire, and Troy Kozma, who is a philosophy professor at the same place. And they argue that John Stuart Mill has probably been the most influential philosopher in interpreting particularly freedom of speech. And if you're now, it's a little dull. Well, it's very scholarly. So let's phrase it that way. I'm using the description my mother gave me of one of my books. Okay.
Oh, that was so funny that she was going to place it by her bedside table to get to sleep.
But what I was going to say is they cover almost every case. I actually, this is where I found one of the cases that we were missing from our First Amendment encyclopedia. Comprehensive coverage. But what I find interesting, and I've written a review that I hope to post in this First Amendment encyclopedia, what I find so problematic about it, and they actually show, by the way, they show that, okay, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. actually met John Stuart Mill in England, had conversations with him. They show that Charles Evans Hughes had a picture of John Stuart Mill and one other philosopher in his study. They show that Hugo Black clearly read and understood Mill. But what I find so problematic is we're interpreting the First Amendment by the principles of someone who wasn't even alive when the Constitution was written and isn't even an American. And I don't doubt that they're right,
Mm.
but what principle of constitutional interpretation is this? You know, I'm just read and said, this is fascinating, but I don't think they quite understand how fascinating it is. This is problematic. Why are we interpreting it through the lens? And I've done the same thing, by the way. I've made the same arguments in class and I've used the same source. But when you put it in the book, it's like, well, hold on. Shouldn't we be reading? And I do, of course. What did James Madison think? He's the primary author of the First Amendment. To some extent, what do we in Blackstone say in England at the time? To what degree were we incorporating or not incorporating the English understanding? But I find it just a fascinating book. I mean, it would be like, it's not quite the same, but what if you found out that, Fourth Amendment law had largely been determined by the writings of Karl Marx? We'd say, well, what's Karl Marx after, right? And again, John Stuart Mill, he's a liberal politician, philosopher in England. So he's certainly within the Anglo-American
Part of
legal
our roots.
tradition.
Mhm.
But I still just find it fascinating that someone who comes along, 50, 100 years after the First Amendment has had such an influence on American interpretations of it. So anyway, I highly recommend the book. And especially if you just want, other than the First Amendment Encyclopedia, if you just want a place to look up every case. Now, they don't deal with the religion clauses, but in every case, as far as I can tell, pretty much from Holmes forward, from Schenck versus U.S. Yeah, Schenck. Yeah, Gitlow versus New York, Schenck versus U.S. From 1919 forward, almost every First Amendment free speech case is covered in there. And it's published by, and this is interesting, it's published by Northern Illinois Press, an imprint of, guess,
I have no idea.
Cornell University Press. One is in New York, one is in Illinois. So I've had great fun trying to reference exactly how I'm supposed to do this. So I just wrote it all out. Northern Illinois Press, an imprint of Cornell University Press.
That's strange.
It's strange.
And I think it's important here.
I don't know what he was one of the most, if you ever read the other book he's well known for is his autobiography.
Mm-hmm.
And he was someone, many people believe he was probably one of the most brilliant people in the entire 19th century. His father taught him like Greek and Latin when he was 3 or 4 years old. He was just one of these utter geniuses. And he and his, I believe it was his wife, also wrote on behalf of women. That he was fought on behalf of women's rights. His father, James Mill, was also a utilitarian philosopher. And if I can just add something which will completely befuddle your audience, maybe because I don't know how to say it, but what's interesting is, from my standpoint, the writers of the First Amendment believed in natural rights. And they believed that sort of the First Amendment, freedom of speech and press were related to freedom of religion, which was related to freedom of conscience, which, was dealt with man's relationship to God. And Mill, the utilitarian, is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. They profess not to believe in natural rights. And that's why I think it makes it a little bit problematic that American courts, if they have in fact relied this much on Mill, what is the method of constitutional interpretation that would justify that? Right. Although I guess pragmatism, utilitarianism, I mean, that is a method of constitutional interpretation. But it's more, I don't know, it sounds a little dicey to me.
And speaking of those who are highly intelligent, it's absolutely, I can't grasp how well you know all of this law You can cite the case names and the time periods. And I'm like, oh yeah, Nix.
Well, I just read the book, so that helped.
No, I fully agree, Virginia. I'm like over here being like, well, the vibe of this one law that was sometime in the 1900s, and he's like, actually, on this, like, I cannot like conceptualize how much of a catalog of information you have in your brain. It's fascinating.
Well, it helps if you don't have a personal life. If you just spend all your life reading cases.
Right, and you ignore the call from your wife, and
Well, that's right. I hope the house wasn't on fire.
No, it's good stuff. Yeah. I'm like, oh yeah, the armband case. That's right. Yeah. So the catalog of knowledge, catch our
It's
weekly
so
wine,
impressive.
catch the law unscripted, to hear this catalog of knowledge, and Chelsea and I trying to wrap our brains around it as you do as well. Like and subscribe so you can see it. Go to that free encyclopedia of the First Amendment through Middle Tennessee State University, and catch the law unscripted bar preparation classes. Even if you're not taking the bar, if you have any interest in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, it's a great walkthrough of what these mean, what the implications are. You're going to hear the content neutral issues, the time, place, and manner. So if you want a more detailed review, go to these sites for it. Enjoy your wine, grab a glass of wine. We didn't talk about our wine at all, even though it is the Legal Weekly Wine, but we've been drinking. We hope that you've had a good happy hour, a good commute to work, as you explore the implications of the continuing campus protests, what you can and can't do. Weigh in on your own. Please be polite. Please don't use bad language. We're trying not to as well. We're trying to be professional. So we ask that you do too. And we will catch you next time. Don't forget, we are following the Trump trial week by week. So don't forget to catch those. And then we're trying to do a second video at least once a week, maybe once every other week, on things outside of the Trump trial that are affecting the country, the world as we know it, for legal issues. And we will catch you next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.